So after 2 months, I finally got my block back from the machine shop. I painted it black, and today I'll be assembling the crank, installing the rear seal, and checking for thrust. So the all the main spun, except for the thrust in the front, all of these spun, and I think number 3 or number 2 spun so badly that that the machinist had to get a new cap and had a line hone. I mean, if you're getting ARP bolts or studs, you have to align hone, and I was already getting ARP bolts, so good thing I was gonna get an align hone anyways. But I'm not sure if you guys can see, but my machinist told me that this was bad. All the bearings spun. All the rod bearings and all the main bearings spun. And I just decided to go for a 383 because why not? So right now I got just some WD-40 sprayed on the surface. I gotta wipe off. I'm not sure how clean this should be. But I would like for it to be clean, just in. So the machinist told me that both the rod and main bearing clearances are 2 thou, which is 0.002, or is it 0.0002? I don't know. One of those. And I bought a stroker kit off Summit. It's an Eagle stroker kit. Came fully balanced. Came with the crank, the rods, the bearings, the pistons, the flex plate, and the harmonic balancer. It's external balance, and it came balanced already for around 860, I believe. I'll leave it in the description if you guys are interested. The only problem that I had with the kit so far is that it said it was going to come with Keith Black pistons, but it came with sealed power, and the Eagle rods had to have the Eagle rod. The rods are a floating pin, and the bushing on the rods were a little too tight, so my machinist had to hone the rod bushings. But that's about all the problems I've had with the kit so far. Cast crank, hyper pistons, steel rods. Came with the rings too, and I believe the rings should be pre-gapped. I haven't checked that yet. But on the next video, we'll be checking the rings. So this is my first time ever building an engine. And I spent so far like $4 grand, 4 or 5,000. So hopefully everything goes well. You know, I don't want to start knocking right after first startup. That would suck. So here are the main bearings that came with the kit. King. That's the part number. So I had these sent to my machine shop, and my machinist already measured out the bearings, and that's how he based his measurements for the line home to have all of them be 2 thou. So the one thing you need to do for every build is just clean everything. Clean the pistons, the rods, the crank, clean everything. So the way these bearings go is this part with the groove in it that goes onto the block, and the smooth one goes onto the caps, and the tang right there just goes into the matching spot on the block. So these are the new bearings, all shiny, and these are the old bearings. All the bearings spun. As you can see, there's no shank. The shank's just broke. I believe it goes right there. It just broke off, and all the bearings, all the main spun, all the rods spun. It was insane. When I bought this Jimmy, I was told that that he thought it was the flex plate, and it just made sense to me because it sounded like an external metal sound. It sounded like metal was hitting metal outside the engine because it was so loud, and it was like squealing. So I just thought, oh, maybe the flex plate is wobbling around, and it's smacking the back of the crank. So that's what I thought. And turns out it wasn't the flex plate. Turns out it was the entire engine. I have no idea how this happened. I mean, this is the first time I ever even do engine work. This is my first time putting bearings in. When I got the truck, that was the first time I ever even saw a carburetor. I mean, I knew what a carburetor was. I just never seen one before. I mean, the only reason why I bought it is it was really cheap, about $1,800. It's 4-wheel drive. It's already on lifts. It's already lifted. It's on 35s. You know, and these square bodies are going for a pretty penny now. So that's why I mostly bought it. Pretty cheap. And it's gonna get 383. That's gonna hopefully make 400 plus torque. I'm after torque since this is a 4,000 pound truck. This is mostly going to be a low to mid RPM, 4,500 max RPM. Well, at least I want the engine to be 6,000 max, but when I'm driving, it's going to be most likely 4,500, unless I do a burnout or take it to the strip. But even the thrust bearing, that's also gonna have the groove end on the block part. So the stress bearing isn't wanting to sit flush, so I'm just gonna give it a little love tap with the dead blow. There we go. And I'm just go ahead and do that for all of the bearings, just to make sure that they're all perfectly flat, not one side is just a tiny bit over. So even though I completely trust the machinist on the oil bearing clearances, I'm still going to be checking them with a plastic gauge. So the way you check them is you install the crank completely dry, no assembly lube, no oil. You don't want to rotate it. You just want to install them, and then install the caps and torque them down. And I got the plastic gauge right here, so I'm gonna be checking them. I mean, I'm only gonna be checking about 2. I'm not gonna check all 5. Oh boy. Well, that was easy. Oh. I mean, first time installing a crank, and it went right on. Oh, no, it's not even on. It's actually still floating on the back. So, looks like I gotta move it a little bit back. Nope. That's interesting. They just don't seem to want to go in. The thrust bearing part, is what's stopping it from going down. So I guess what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to lay it down from back to front. There we go. It actually wasn't even straight. It was actually just off. Hopefully that doesn't affect anything. You know, hopefully me banging it down doesn't affect anything either. So before you go in and install your crank, you're gonna wanna clean out all the journals. Just spray some brake cleaner and just wipe them off. You want to spray brake cleaner into all of the oil galleys. And then what I did was I had a little brush, and I just brushed the inside out just to make sure there wasn't anything. But you just go on and clean out all the galleys, all the journals before you install the crank. And now I'm going to be plastic gauging. I'm only going to be plastic gauging just the front, just because it's the easiest. It was already a line hone, so it should be all correct. So here's the plastic gauge. I'm going to be using the inch side. The other side is millimeters. So the way it works is there's a thin strip of wax that you cut to length, and you torque down the main cap, and then you use these gauges to measure out how wide that piece got. So that's the little piece. When you're installing it, you want to make sure that's perfectly in the middle, perfectly straight, because you want to get the most accurate measurement possible. So you want to make sure that where the main caps sit, you want to make sure those are dry, completely dry, because you don't want that fluid to affect the torque spec. You want to make sure that the bearing on the cap is dry, and you also want to make sure that it's facing the correct direction. On mine, there's a little arrow pointing towards the front of the engine, so that's how you want to install it, facing the front. And then you want to torque it down with the bolts you're going to be using. I'm going to be using ARP bolts, and those are torqued to 70 foot-pounds. So as you can see, the main cap, I haven't torqued it down yet, but you can see the main cap does not want to sit flat with the block. So what you do is you grab yourself a mallet or a brass hammer, and you just smack the top. I'm not sure if you saw that, but it's now sitting perfectly flat. And then from there, you just continue to tighten down the bolts. I'm just gonna hand tighten them and then torque them down. So what you wanna do for the ARP bolts, the instructions say to torque them down 3 even steps. First you wanna start off all the way up to 70. So first you wanna start off with 23.3, and then torque them down to 46.6, and then 70. Once you're done, grab a breaker bar, loosen up the bolts and remove the cap, and then we're going to measure for clearance. So when you cut your plastic gauge, you also cut a little bit of the gauge itself that you're going to measure with, and all you got to do is just lay it on top, see which one fits best. So you can see this one is too wide, and you move down to 2/1000. Perfect. That's exactly the measurement that my machinist told me. So I'm not gonna bother measuring the rest. So I'm just gonna now take out the crank, lube up the bearings, install since it's a 2-piece rear main, I'm gonna install the bottom part of the seal, and I'm gonna torque down all the caps and install the seal, and then check for end play. So before we install the crank, since this is a 2-piece rear, we're going to install the top half of the rear seal. That's the part number for the seal I'm using. Comes with the seals, of course, and also comes with a nylon bushing for the oil pump drive shaft, which I won't be using since I'm upgrading it to a metal one. And the metal one is just a superior design. It won't crack over time and just break off. So, looking at the seal, I'm not sure if you can see that. This bigger lip right here, the one with the grooves on it, this faces inwards. So when you're installing the crank, this bigger lip right here will be facing towards the crankshaft into the engine, and this little lip right here goes out to the flex plate. So you can install it, just like you did with the bushings. I mean with the bearings. A lot of people say to offset it by 3/8 so it won't leak. But then people are also adding a sealant to the end, so I don't really see how that. I mean, that just defeats the purpose of offsetting if you're just gonna add a little sealant to the end. So I'll be using Permatex 518. I'm gonna be adding this to the end of the rear main caps so it doesn't leak out from there, just a little. And you're going to have to make sure that's really dry and make sure there's no oil, there's no grease, there's nothing. All right. That's really chunky. All right. That should be good. And what you want to do is just rub it on the surface. I'm also going to add it to the end of the seals. So once you're done adding the sealant, it should look somewhat like this. Now we're going to be adding assembly lube to the seal and all of the bearings. I'm going to be using Lucas assembly lube, semi-synthetic. It's in a green color, so I'm going to be using that. So of course, before you use your assembly lube, you want to make sure that all the surfaces are clean. Just go down and just check. Just wipe them all down one last time. And you're just gonna your assembly lube. You just want to run it on every bearing, and then after that, run it on the bearings and on that lip I showed you on the rear seal. Try not to get it on the sealant. You don't want it wiping off the sealant. Alright. And then with a wipe off a finger, you're gonna just rub it all along the bearing. Alright. So I make sure this doesn't get on the mating surface of the caps, because you don't want that to affect the torque. So before you install the crank for the last time, hopefully, you're gonna want to clean off all the main galley bearings, all the journals. You're gonna want to clean all 5 out. Even if you already cleaned them, just go back and wipe it off with a towel and some brake clean. Here we go. Oh, that was easy. So now it's time to install the bearings on the caps, install the rear seal. We already have it installed. You want to go ahead, wipe all the bearings off, and add assembly lube to all of the journals and the bearings, and then we're gonna install the bolts. We're not gonna torque them all the way, maybe to around 40, and then we're gonna check end play. So it's been a few days since I installed the crank. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to record the process of how I checked for end play, so I'm just gonna tell you. So before you install your caps, what you want to do is not add a lot of assembly lube to the rear main, because the assembly lube is going to squeeze out and it's going to go on the thrust surface, and that can affect end play. Well, it won't affect end play, but it'll just affect the reading you get. And then when you're installing the caps, when you're installing the bolts, what you want to do is add, if you're using ARP, go ahead and use the lubricant. You use it on the threads and on the bottom of the head. I don't think you should add it on the bottom of the washer, just on the bottom of the head. And make sure that all the washers have the chamfer facing up. That's the direction it has to be. And then when you're installing the bolts, make sure you're installing the caps the right way. Make sure they have the arrow pointing forward, and if they're marked, make sure you have them in order. I have mine in order, and they're all facing that way. The only one you don't have to worry about is the rear main, but just make sure they're all facing the correct direction and they're all the correct placement. So when you're installing the bolts, you want to hand tighten them all the way until they're flat with the cap. And you want to do is take a dead blow or a rubber mallet or something soft. What you want to do is, sometimes the caps won't sit flat. They won't sit very flat with the block. So what you're going to do is take a mallet, smack the top of it until it sits flat on all sides. You're going to want to do that with every single main, even the rear. Just go on and make sure that they're all flat before you start torquing them down. Just go and smack them a few times. You'll probably be able to hear it seat correctly. And then hand tighten the bolts. But also make sure that the threads are clean, because if the threads aren't clean, they're not gonna torque down correctly, and they're not gonna want to torque down all the way. So when you're torquing down the bolts, the order I did them in is, I'm not sure if there's a correct order or not, but what I did, there is a correct order if you have a 4-bolt. For the 4-bolt, you want to start with the inner ones. You want to start with either this one or that one, and then go down to the outer two. So what I did, I started off with the inner ones, torque those down. This is our ARP. It'll torque them down to 3 even steps to 70. So 23, 46, 70. So start with 23, 23, and then you go down 23, 23, and then I moved on to this one. Torque down the inners to 23, the outers, and then I went on to this one, inners, outers. Torque down these to 23, these to 23, and then I repeated the steps from 46 all the way up to 70. So once you torque down all the mains, what you're gonna want to do is untorque the rear, loosen it up all the way until it's hand tight. Loosen it up and then hand tighten it. And then what you're gonna want to do is smack the crank back and forth from the snout and the flange, back and forth 4 times, with the last smack being on the flange forward. What that's gonna do is gonna align the thrust bearing to check end play. And what else I did is, when I was torquing down the rear main, after you smack it, you can start torquing down. What I did was I put a screwdriver. If you guys have a pry bar, that's perfect. I just had a kind of big screwdriver. What I did is I put it between between the weight and the block, and if you can't, maybe like a weight and maybe this weight and the main right here, just pry it forward. That's what you want to do. You want to have it prying forward so it aligns the top cap as well. So while you're prying it forward, you want to start torquing it down. So 23, then 46, and 70. And then once you're done, you go on ahead, you get your dial gauge, you get your stand. I got this stand and dial gauge from the Summit Racing cam degree kit, so I didn't need to buy anymore. What you wanna do is make sure that the gauge is the dial is perfectly straight. So make sure come on top, make sure that it's straight on top, and make sure it's straight from the side. You want to make sure this thing is perfectly straight. And then you're going to have to pry the crank back. So what I did is put a screwdriver between the block and flange right here, moved it back, and then zeroed out the gauge. And then I got a screwdriver, and then I put it in between here, pried it forward, and the spec for it is 3 to 11 thousandths, and I was around 4, which I was, every method I tried, I got 4. I just want to make sure that was accurate, which it is. So I'm now getting 4 thousandths. I'm not sure if I'll be able to show you. It's zeroed out now. Hold up. It kind of requires some force. Can't really do it with my left hand. But yeah, I was getting 4 thou. You're probably gonna have to pry with 2 hands. I'm not sure if that's good or not when it comes to bending a weight or not. I'm not sure that's even possible, but don't try to pry it. Don't be trying to pry it on something like this, because it will slip, and if it slips, your screwdriver is gonna go right across that journal and scratch it up. So when you're done torquing it all the way down, make sure there's lube on all the bearings before you even torque it down. And then you want to start spinning it by hand. As you can see, this thing spins perfectly. I mean, it doesn't spin freely, like it doesn't like a bearing. When you spin a bearing, it just goes on for a few seconds. Because the assembly lube is so thick and I put so much of it. I'm assuming that's where all the friction's coming from. But make sure to spin the crank a few times. Make sure that it spins with even pressure. If you're spinning it and then all of a sudden it gets really tough to spin, let's just say you're spinning it freely and then it just stops and it's like really hard, like you're like tightening down a bolt, like how it feels to tighten down a bolt, and then it just frees up. You're gonna want to check that out, because that shouldn't happen. It should be able to spin freely. No matter how many times you spin it, it should be able to spin perfectly. So what else I did was, once you're done torquing down all the bolts, and you see this yellow marker paint on the bolts, what I did is I placed that to make sure that it confirms that I already torqued everything down, so I don't go and recheck it again. I already checked that I torqued down everything to 70, and then after that, I got this industrial paint marker from Harbor Freight, and I just marked it across. And what that does is, having it perfectly straight, or all of them in the same direction, is that also makes sure that the bolt isn't coming loose. So in the future, when you're running it and you drop the pan for whatever reason, you can always just make sure that all the bolts have the paint marks perfectly straight in the same direction, so you can see that the bolts aren't coming loose. I'm not sure how common that is, but I just did it. So this paint marker works pretty good. It was pretty cheap at Harbor Freight, made in the USA. So in the next video, I'll be installing the rod and pistons, and I'll hopefully have an update on the eBay head soon. And so if you have any questions, let me know down in the comments or DM me on Instagram. And see ya.